Sweat, lies, and pornography. Oh, yes, they went there while breaking the fourth wall multiple times. And did Heather do a slip up in regards to her children and their sexuality? All of that in this eighth episode of Real Housewives of Orange County, season 16. I am Nick Zangl, and let us get into the recap and our reactions to this episode. But make sure, if you're joining live or even on the replay, to leave your take on what's going on in the comment section wherever you are tuning in from. And let's get right into it, picking up with right where we left off last episode, where now Emily, Gina, and Noella are arriving back to the dinner table at the Cabo San Lucas restaurant they are all at on their girls' trip. Now, mind you, this is just hours after Noella arrived, a day later than everyone else, and went from a day of travel to an empty house and then straight to meet up with the girls for this dinner. So that is the context around why Noella may be acting a little weird in this scene, coupled with a lot of things besides drinking and being tired and whatnot. But it appears Noella has not calmed down as a result of Gina and Emily's attempt to pull her aside and try to smooth things out with her and Heather. But because Noella seems to think that Gina and Emily are acting different here because of Heather. And Gina in her confessional is comparing her handling of Noella to being middle management, and the challenges of being middle management being the reason that no one wants that job. Now, before we move on, some quick thoughts on this dinner that I didn't share at the end of the last episode and that I want to share now after simmering on this and rewatching this back before the new episode aired. One being, I don't think it was abnormal for Heather to be frustrated with Noella for ordering food and then not eating it and making a big deal out of this, because it just shows Noella is kind of out of touch and a little bit rude. Now, maybe this was a way for her to try to kind of explain to the group that she may have some food relationship challenges that she's not coming out blatantly to say. But until you say that is the problem, people are going to assume that you're just rude or just disrespectful. And I think Gina was actually right in saying, if you're going to not eat the food, at least try to be subtle about it and not bring too much attention to it. But also, when you have food issues, sometimes that is your way to kind of seek help or kind of get people to notice that. Another thing I wanted to point out was that last episode, Heather got on Noella for being picky about the way she wanted to drink her tequila shot, being chilled instead of warm. And upon further digestion and a rewatch of this last episode, I think it actually comes off rather elitist of Heather to say this. And I think Heather was trying to come off relatable and trying to take a tequila shot because she's usually a champagne person, but it actually came off as her kind of saying people who drink tequila or tequila in general is something of a lower standard and not worthy of putting more time into having a quality drink. Let me know if you had any similar thoughts on this or if you thought it was a little bit of an elitist comment. But anyways, let's keep going to now at the dinner table. Heather is FaceTiming the men who are back in Orange County out to dinner themselves, minus Noella's husband, of course, and Jen's husband, Ryan, was not present as well. Jen says she wishes her husband was a part of the husband crew, but we weren't really filled in on why he wasn't there. I'm guessing maybe it was either he was on a business trip or he was with the kids, which to me are both good reasons to not go out. But we shall see if anything else comes of this, if they are truly leaving him out on purpose. I can imagine the guys wouldn't do that because in the history of Real Housewives, usually despite the women's differences, the men tend to get along. Not always, and it appears when Heather was FaceTiming Terry at the table, Jen had a smile on her face. Maybe she was pretending that she wasn't hurt or anything, and maybe she thought Ryan had been notified or not and then didn't realize till after he wasn't. Who knows? But anyways, we then cut to the men at their dinner, where basically we only see them talking about their relationships with their women on this trip. And John is saying how he is happy where him and Shannon are and are in no rush to get married. Terry is then pressing Travis on when he sees marriage will happen with him and Gina, and he says it's kind of a 1 to 3 year timeline. And then, of course, they end up the scene having a kind of ball-busting, laughing, drinking, eating moment between them, as the guys typically do. And then we get back to quickly the girls in Cabo, where Emily now has a napkin around her head as a sweatband. And this is followed by her and Shannon having to explain to Noella their nicknames of Tequila Emily and Fun Shannon. Then somehow Emily brings up a question of if Shannon would ever have a threesome with John and who she would bring. Now, on the after show of this on Bravo's YouTube channel and BravoTV.com, Emily clarified she brought this topic up because it's kind of a typical fun banter on a girls' trip. Obviously, I'm not a girl. I've never been on a girls' trip, so I wouldn't know that. But also, she likes to see Shannon squirm, and bringing up sex and certain topics that Shannon doesn't like talking about is an easy way to get that done. Now, Shannon says no, she would never have a threesome with her and John because she and John don't need another reason or another person to complete them. And although she says she doesn't have judgment of people who do it, it's not for her. And then everyone kind of seems to be happy to hear this, knowing John and Shannon are so happy with each other that they don't need anybody else. And this then opens a conversation up about Shannon's plan for the future with John after she defines John as single when he goes out without her because they aren't married. Shannon then says they plan to buy a house together once their kids are all off at college in a few years. Now, let me know what you think of Shannon classifying him as single when they're not together. And let me know if you think this indicates she might be looking at their relationship as more of a business arrangement than an actual relationship. Because to me, I think socially, you would consider him taken or in a relationship. And you would only put that he was single if you were filling out paperwork where you put like single, married, which is basically the only two options. And maybe this is a sign that they're kind of on a business relationship more than a committed one. But now we also understood why they only talked about showed a certain part of the conversation with the men, because that was what they were leading us onto for this conversation. So then we have Noella interjecting in the conversation, trying to point out her and Shannon's conversations about Shannon's kids and how Noella sees them as her soulmates and pride and joy at the moment and her focus. And Shannon says how her kids would love to meet Noella at some point, where Noella is coining herself the crazy aunt Noella. Gina is then pointing out in her confessional how Noella tries to dominate every conversation and make it about herself, which was very clear in this scene, supporting my theory last episode that I touched on of Noella acting out and trying to steer and control the conversations because her life right now is very up in the air and very powerless, and she probably doesn't feel that she's in control of her life at the moment because of everything going on. But then we get Jen and Heather getting up to go to the bathroom, and this is where Heather kind of is checking in on Gina, who looks a little in distress after kind of being annoyed by what's going on with Noella. And as you see here, Heather was kind of touching and embracing Gina's face as kind of a check-in to kind of like show she cares. Noella then picks up on this and sees it as kind of weird and then starts making fun of Heather when they walk away, or after they walk away, kind of imitating her on Emily's face, which that mimicking on Emily's face seems to annoy Emily. And this is where Emily goes, you need to like tone it down a little bit. You're going too far. This is what we've been talking about. And then this is when they continue to have more drunken fun at the table, with conversation being playful, and then a warning from Gina about seeing Emily kind of going to that Hulk place after she's been drinking a little bit, where then Shannon is joining in on the fun, but again, Noella is trying to control the conversation again by getting the conversation back on the rails about Shannon and John, where in her confessional, Noella says she thinks Gina and Emily's IQ points drop when they are hanging out together, and they are so close that they might even be on the same cycle. Now, on Watch What Happens Live, Gina commented back on this, saying she thought it was a stupid, inaccurate comment by Noella to talk about their IQ points, and she thinks that hurt people. So this might be another thing to add to the list of Noella just acting out and not really thinking before she speaks. Now, Noella then calls Gina and Emily children as Noella gets up from one side of the table to go over to sit by Shannon, since Shannon wants to talk to her, but Gina and Emily seem to just want to have fun and do their own thing. Now, in her confessional, Emily confesses to saying that she thinks Noella shouldn't be calling her a child or Gina a child, because Noella is the one that couldn't barely even get to Mexico because she didn't know how to board a flight to get here on a commercial flight. So I thought that was a good point. But Gina and Emily then try to leave the table and go home because they think Noella is being offensive by calling them children. Now, Gina then confronts Noella as they are getting up, saying, "You are reactionary in this moment." And Noella doesn't seem to be taking well to Gina pointing this out to her, even though it's an accurate depiction of what's been happening. And then Gina calls her out again, saying, "Oh, do you want me to tell you how you're perfect again?" And Noella's like, "No." And then Gina says, "Okay, well, it appears you're being annoying and reactive and all this other stuff." And at this point, Gina is kind of stating how she's kind of over trying to protect and stand up for Noella because Noella keeps coming back at Gina, doesn't seem to be very appreciative of this. And this is where the night ends very quickly. So let's see who's in the chat. Looks like everything is good on my end. Let's check the Rumble chat very quickly and see what's going on. It looks like everything is good for now. All right. So let's keep going to the next day. It's the morning, and Shannon is now beginning her day FaceTiming her boyfriend John, and she is pointing out her exhaustion from Heather's meticulous planning of a full trip. Now, this is a slight contrast to Gina's take on Heather's kind of controlling personality that we heard her share from last episode, but Noella is now meeting up with Gina and Emily to go to a sweat lodge as she is recounting the horrible night before of arguments with them and her not being able to sleep because of it. So then they arrive at the sweat lodge, and Emily is sharing about her travels abroad in college in Mexico, making this kind of feel like a home experience to her. And they are now getting smothered with smoke before entering the sweat lodge, which is supposed to release things they are holding on to find answers for things in their life. Now, as we're there's no cameras inside the sweat lodge, but we are hearing from the outside the three of them inside this sweat structure, adobe house thing, hearing them getting emotional about things, and as they're kind of coming out and spilling out of them, whether it was sweat or snot or tears, leading us to hearing Noella dry heaving, and we actually hear Emily calling for someone to get Noella out of there. Now we then see the camera crew for the first time in this episode, and the sound guys on camera breaking that fourth wall and them asking for a medic to grab Noella and take her to a room with a fan and getting her cooled down and with fluids, where Noella appears to have passed out for a minute or so. And as that is happening, Gina and Emily are outside on a bench drinking Gatorade, explaining emotionally how surreal the experience was, where Gina is then explaining how tough it was to be between Noella and Emily as they were pouring out these emotions. And Emily is saying in her confessional, she felt like all the trauma and hurt from her life came out of her during this experience. Noella is now feeling a little better and joins Gina and Emily on that bench. And now Noella is worried for Gina, who seems to be struggling with what just happened, seeing and hearing Emily and Noella's experience and then pouring out their emotions. So they agree to wash off and head back to the home for margaritas and relaxing by the pool, but we end up seeing that they didn't really end up doing that and they just fell asleep right when they got home. Now, this whole scene seemed pretty serious to me. It didn't seem like it was overreacting or fake, but I wondered if Noella's more extreme reaction was because of her more severe life circumstances at the moment, and she was drinking a lot the night before and eating a little less and just more emotional in general. And we'll hear another cast member's take on this a little later, but on Watch What Happens Live, Gina said they were given some sort of tea to drink as well, and that might have been contributing to what was going on. And that also made me think of stories people share of taking, I think it's called ayahuasca. It's like some healing drink that does similar things to this. So let me know if you thought of the similar aspect to this. But meanwhile, Heather is meeting up with her friend Tawnie, who appears to have also been in Cabo, coincidentally staying at the resort right down the way. So I thought that was interesting. Maybe this is Heather's attempt at replacing Nicole with Tawnie as the friend of the show. We'll see, but it does seem rather convenient of the timing. But also, they haven't done an after show on the Bravo YouTube channel or the website until this episode aired. And This indicates to me they may have been waiting to phase out Nicole from the show before starting to do that and kind of ending that storyline, but we'll see. Anyways, Shannon and Jen then join them in the tour where they're touring a home and some land for their future vacation home. They're also joined by the architect and his daughter and their real estate agent. Now, first, they tour an existing 26,000 square foot oceanfront home. Shannon points out that that was the size of her old home, but also how this tour was a little less detailed than Heather's personal house tour, and says that this reminds her that she's in a stage of her life where she doesn't really need this really large home, but more of a cozy home. Not sure if Shannon's saying that out of need or out of want, but we will keep going to seeing them arrive at a plot of land on the beach above the oldest structure in Cabo, which is a lighthouse, but also it's below a new lighthouse overlooking both the Sea of Cortez and the Pacific Ocean. We learned that the lot is $8 million for 1 acre. If I was hearing that correctly, they said a little bit over an acre. And they said they're going to aim for $500 per square foot of building, with a 15,000 square foot building coming out to a total of $15.5 million. Now, they break the news of this to Terry via FaceTime, and Heather is saying how she needs to kind of pull off a little more sexual distraction to get Terry on board. But we get left with a joke of a cliffhanger on the decision from Terry about him needing to borrow the $15 million from being their architect, which he clearly indicates he's nervous to spend that much money. But I don't know if I believe him that he's hesitant or that he thinks that is a small amount of money or a big amount of money for them. So now we are back at the house. Noella, Gina, and Emily are on the beach later that day, and now with some cloud cover, so it looks like it's a little bit cooler because we've been seeing them sweating a lot this trip. But they have champagne after joking Gina looks like the beach hat salesman who they saw walking up. And Emily then spills the beans about Noella being left out of travel plans and how Gina had to convince Heather to invite her on the trip in general. Gina doesn't seem happy Emily did this, and in her confessional, Emily confesses to being an asshole for even bringing this up. And on the after show, admitted that she was, or at least she didn't admit, but Shannon said she saw this as Emily being a pot stir. Now, Noella seems hurt by this news of her being basically a pity invite, but appears to be taking this as Heather acknowledging Noella is seeing through Heather's BS. They end this conversation by giving Noella advice on how to get back in Heather's good graces, but Noella seems to think they are saying this out of fear of Heather, similar to her interpretation of their reaction at dinner we saw earlier in this episode. The conversation then quickly turns to sex again, by Noella bringing up what Emily shared the night before about Shane and her. If they don't work out, then she would bring Gina into a threesome, where Emily then confesses to experimenting with women in college, and Noella seems overly excited, as you see here, to hearing this news because it gives her a chance to talk about her sexuality more, in my opinion, which is something that she tends to like to talk about a lot. Jen is now in the gym FaceTiming her husband, crying because she is in so much pain with her leg, as we learned earlier on the house tour and property tour where Jen shared she was in a lot of pain because she didn't get a chance to work out before that. And her husband is basically giving her a cold reception, clearly not what Jen wants or needs at this moment. And she's then explaining to him emotionally how she wants him to show more empathy toward her. And then we see her bawling on the elliptical as the scene ends, and we see the second break in at the fourth wall in this episode, a little more subtle this time, which is behind Jen's shoulder in the mirror. You see a producer with their cell phone basically filming this, and we'll revisit this whole scene in general, but I thought it was interesting another fourth wall breaking here. I'm not sure if they meant to film it like that or they had to because the big camera crew would have been seen in the mirror. Who knows? But we are now getting ready for dinner on the beach for their last night in Cabo, and everyone seems to be getting along during the pre-dinner drinks at the house bar, but things quickly turn following a tequila tasting, which I'm guessing Heather thought this was beneath her, judging by her comments from the end of last episode about tequila, And also a toast by Heather thanking everyone coming, then sending it around the table, which is a throwback to the early days of Heather on the show, talking about what she does with her friends, having to clink glasses with eye contact all the way around the table. But the conversation quickly turns south when Noella is sharing about how she passed out in the sweat lodge, and Jen then points out in her confessional how she was not surprised to hear this based on Noella's drinking and her not eating as much and her emotional distress that she's under. But Gina and Emily then step away to go potty, saying that they had natural births, and Jen and Heather kind of make a comment saying, we can't relate because we both had C-sections. But then they get into kind of a deeper talk about their marriage in general, mostly Heather explaining, similar to last episode, to Jen what she needs to do with Ryan to keep their marriage going strong. After Jen shares what we saw earlier regarding Ryan's lack of empathy, and then Jen's frustration when she needs something because she does everything for her family and she doesn't feel like it's getting reciprocated. Now, quick note on this. I appreciate she's talking about this because I personally want to be married and have kids one day. And seeing this, plus seeing relationships in my real life, of course, gives me a lot of examples to take away things that I want and things that I don't want in that, and what works and what doesn't, to hopefully avoid some of these issues in my personal life a little later. So I thought that was I'm glad they're opening up about this, even though it's probably uncomfortable and a little embarrassing to expose on national television. We'll probably see that embarrassment come out a little bit more in the next couple weeks. But meanwhile, Shannon and Noella are talking on the other end of the table, and Shannon is comparing what is going on this night to the night before, where Noella is actually putting the blame for the night before having issues on Gina over Emily, which is her correcting Shannon, who appeared to have thought that Emily was the one causing the problems. Now, Noella is saying the real problem is that they tag team, Emily and Gina, and that's where things get weird. When they're one-on-one with one or the other, then there doesn't seem to be any problems. But everyone is now back at the table, and Shannon is then attempting to squash the beef from the night before, even though they already figured it out, because we've seen Noella, Gina, and Emily doing multiple activities earlier in the day that they seem to not have problems. But Heather is then heard saying under her breath, "Are we really doing this again?" Followed by Emily forcing Heather and Noella to address their issues directly to each other. Now, Noella starts by confronting Heather about feeling like a pity invite. In the after show, Heather actually confirms that it was a pity invite because of their history together. But Heather explains to Noella at the dinner table that she felt like it was a pity invite and she didn't want to invite Noella because, quote, "You gave my daughter pornography as a gift." Now, everyone at the table, besides Gina and Shannon, are shocked hearing this. One, because Gina already knew about this, and we got a flashback to Shannon being filled in by Heather about this the day before. And the reason they reacted the way they did is because it's quite the claim. And Noella is rightfully shocked by hearing this, defending herself, saying, "This was something I got off Amazon. And I thought giving Heather's bisexual daughter an LGBTQ+ gift as a bisexual older woman was a nice gesture." And then Noella confesses this is even low for Heather in her confessional. Now, Gina is trying to make it clear to Noella that Heather shared this with her, but Gina didn't tell anybody else but after that. And she suggests Noella say she didn't know the game was inappropriate, say sorry, and move on. But Noella seems to dismiss this wise suggestion. Jen then echoes what Gina said, and then is followed by Heather saying she thinks Noella is looking to start problems with her, and Shannon then yells, trying to get attention, and join in echoing Gina, Emily, and Jen to kind of sort this out. But this is where things continue to go south, and I will decipher kind of what is about to come out and give some context to what was said here after breaking it down as someone from Orange County. But Noella then condescendingly, in a passive-aggressive way, says, "Oh, how dare I not know about your straight fragility when buying this?" Where Heather rightfully takes that personally and adds, "I have a couple of gay children. Don't tell me about straight fragility." Followed by Noella doubling down, saying, "I'm a bisexual, biracial, liberal woman in Orange County. Don't tell me I'm inappropriate." And that's where Heather goes, "Oh, no, I was not calling you inappropriate. I was saying the game and the gift you sent my daughter was inappropriate." This is followed by Heather again trying to give the benefit of the doubt to Noella, saying, I think you just didn't read the cards, but Noella is still not giving in to Heather. So Heather then pulls out her phone and starts reading what some of the cards said, which we heard her do last week. But this time she's doing it in front of the whole group, and Noella is horrified. Clearly, she didn't know what these cards said or the extent of what they said, and everyone seems to be on that same page and thinking it was inappropriate. And then in her confessional, Noella says, she wouldn't have given that gift to a 17-year-old if she knew what the contents of those cards were. Heather then says she again asks to please not pull those identity cards out, saying she's not supportive of those things because she is clearly very supportive of her kids with all different sexual orientations. Heather then confesses Noella is calculated in having these cards to pull out when she gets in trouble, and Heather thinks that's not how you win, and I agree. But this episode ends with Noella saying she's sorry in a defeated tone and clearly wants this conversation to end and for them to move on because she isn't looking good from this and is exhausted from causing a scene and trying to win against Heather. Now let's break down this entire scene because there was a lot here. First, relating to Noella bringing up her identity as a bisexual, biracial, liberal woman living in Orange County, this is her way of saying, from what I understand, Orange County is traditionally known as the most populated conservative area of California, although in recent years it has gone a little more liberal, if the reported numbers are accurate. But basically she's pointing out this, and her pointing this out basically appears to be to skirt any responsibility in this situation. I respect Heather for not giving into Noella trying to weaponize her identity, even though I have criticized Heather for seemingly exploiting her daughter on the show related to her identity. But at least Heather isn't trying to weaponize it against people at this point. And I guess the white fragility thing is a sexual version of, or the straight fragility is a sexual or play on of white fragility. I don't know. I think maybe Noella is this term. I don't know if that's a title she wants to claim or not, but anyways, I do think Heather was projecting a little bit in this scene when she claimed Noella was calculated. And I think she may actually be giving Noella too much credit here because I think Noella is just all over the place and paranoid, possibly because she is new to the camera or maybe is still dealing with everything going on in her life. And I do think, though, I agree with Noella saying that calling this pornography was a little bit of a stretch, but we know Heather knows the game of reality TV and that over dramatizing everything helps for drama and to help her keep her position on the show. Now, we were luckily spared again from hearing Heather read the inappropriate card game phrases, but it was a little more easier to read her lips this time, so it was kind of hard to ignore or to have it covered up, if that makes sense. And finally, I thought it was interesting Heather said actually in this scene that she had a couple gay children, because I thought Max, her daughter, was the only one that was out about not being straight. So I wonder if Heather accidentally said this or one of her kids came out as not straight and I just am not aware of this, or maybe she was just trying to not make it about one of her kids and basically trying to prove the point to Noella, accusing her of not understanding, to try to prove the point, saying, I'm supportive of all my kids, regardless of who they are or what they come out as. But on the after show, we actually got a little bit more clarity from Noella, who brought up a good point of Heather not coming to Noella right away if this was such an egregious thing that she did with these cards, instead of going around and telling Gina and Shannon. But that also supports what I just said about Heather's dramatizing everything, but also it kind of puts a crack or shows a little crack in Heather's agenda. Maybe she exposed herself here by approaching it this way and not making it as serious, meaning she's probably looking at this storyline as a little more playful and kind of business oriented. I don't know. Let me know what you think. We are going to wrap up here, but before you go, make sure wherever you are tuning in from to give this episode a thumbs up or a like or an upvote or a rating, whatever it is on whatever platform you're watching, and make sure to do whatever you have to do to make sure you don't miss another episode wherever you are tuning in from. And with that said, make sure to leave all your thoughts in any comment section you're able to find for this episode. And I will talk to you in the next one. Bye-bye. Thank you for joining.